Hey everyone, my name is Sebastian, and I'm one of the co-founders of Pima Studios, a framework for creating on-chain games and autonomous worlds. And today we're going to talk about Timelock Encryption. Now, what is Timelock Encryption and why is it so important for these kinds of gaming use cases? Well, imagine you want to have a strategy game, okay? And inside the strategy game, it's turn-based, and people have 24 hours to make a move. Okay, so all the players, say maybe you have like 1,000 players, they all have 24 hours to make a move, and then once the 24-hour period is done, all the moves are executed. So this is a very common system inside strategy games. But the problem is, well, how do you do this in a decentralized way, right? Because if you have, a blockchain, and everybody posts their moves over time, and then you have like a deadline here, the problem is that you can see everybody's moves as they happen. So you have an incentive to come in last because you will get to know what moves everybody else did before you and be able to use that to your advantage. So we want to avoid this problem, right? Now, a common technique to avoid this is called a commit reveal scheme. Commit reveal. And as the name implies, this scheme uses two steps. So first you commit to a value, and then you reveal the value. Now, the idea of a commitment is that you choose a value ahead of time. So you say, like, okay, I will choose, like, for example, the number 5, but I'll put in the box that, like, basically encrypts this so nobody can know it's 5. But I'm committing to this value. So committing means, like, you cannot change it after the fact. And then later on, I would reveal the actual value of 5, and everybody can see that I placed 5 and it matches my commitment. So an easy way to do this is using hash functions, right? So here you do hash of 5, and then here you reveal 5. So now anybody can see the value, check that the hash of the value matches your commitment, and then know that you told the truth. In fact, you see this fairly often in places like Twitter. You might have seen like some influencers post like, like a large string of letter, and they say like, oh, this is my prediction for something in the future. And later on, maybe like a week later, they'll reveal like what the text was and say like, hey, look, I knew this was going to happen. Like, look, I posted the commitment a week ago and this is the real value. This is the same idea. Now, this does solve the problem kind of, but note that it introduces two steps into your game, right? Now you need a commit step and you need a reveal step. And this is not a great user experience because it means that now your game is much slower, right? Because maybe this is 24 hours and this is another 24 hours, so your game is now running twice as slow. It also means that users have to come online to reveal. Note like this pre-image is only known by the player. So it means that if you're playing this game, you need to put your computer online, submit your move, wait until the 24-hour period is done, bring your computer online again, and then submit your move, right? And like not only does this make the game longer, like it's hard to probably convince users, hey, turn on your machine, load up the game. There's something you have to do. It's just like it'll automatically submit your move, and then you can close the game again. It's like not something that intuitively makes sense to people who are not engineers, and it's not a great user experience. So we want to have some kind of, time lock encryption, which is encrypting something that will be revealed in the future without using this kind of commit reveal scheme. And the way we do this is that we will have, first of all, some kind of server somewhere. And the server will split time into discrete chunks. So maybe these are like 3 seconds, 3 seconds, 3 seconds. Okay? And because these are split into chunks by seconds, you can refer to these as like rounds. So this would be like round 0, round 1, round 2, round 3, round 4, round 5. Okay? And you want to encrypt to a specific round. So you say like, okay, instead of encrypting like, 24 hours, you say like, okay, we encrypt to round 5, or you encrypt to round 4, or like more realistically, like commit to round like 10,000. Right? At some point, you commit to a round in the future. Now, how does this work in practice? The way you do this is that for every round, you have a new secret key and a new public key. Right? So we're basically replacing our commit reveal system with an encryption scheme. So now you are encrypting to a specific future round. Now, if you know anything about encryption, you know there's usually two main ways to encrypt something. Over here. So one is encrypt with password. I think this is the scheme that probably everybody here is most familiar with. It's one that makes sense. You have a secret password, you encrypt with this password. Nobody can decrypt unless you know that password. A second one that is actually very common, but you might not know, is encrypt with public key. So let's say there's a public key, and you know this public key, and you want to encrypt your message so that it can only be decrypted if the person knows the private key for this public key. And this is really common in systems where you have basically like distributed key servers. One good example of this is like some of the email systems for like encryption. But another good example of this is blockchains. So on blockchains, everybody has a public key, so you can encrypt a message so that it can only be decrypted by whoever owns the private key for that address. So this option number 2 is actually very common, and that's why you will also sometimes see some people online saying like, hey, if you want to send me an encrypted email, here's my PGP key or something like that, which is like, this key that you can encrypt messages to so they can only be decrypted by them. Okay. So now we know about these two encryption systems. Now you can see why we have a secret key and a public key for every round. Because it means that you can basically take your move, and then, so you take your move and then you encrypt it using the public key of that specific round. Okay? So it means that the only way this will ever get decrypted is if somebody has a secret key for that round. Now this makes sense intuitively, but the problem is, well, where does the secret key come from? Right? We could say like, oh, Joe, who's the CEO of this gaming company, owns the secret key, they generate the secret keys, and then we trust them to like reveal the secret key at the right time. This is not ideal, right? We want to build a decentralized game in an autonomous world. We don't want to rely on a single entity, a single company in charge of generating these secret keys and then providing them to us, because if this game has any financial value, they could cheat at the game, because they would be able to see all the moves as they come in, decrypt them as they come in, and then make their move knowing this information and easily win, which is not an ideal situation. So we don't want like some central party to own the secret key for these rounds. So how do we solve this? Now, there's going to be two parts to this. So first part is something called like escrow, or like backdoors. So you might have heard people talk about like backdoors in cryptography and the ideas behind that. Sometimes you hear people like, oh, like I think the NSA has a backdoor to this cryptographic scheme. What that means is that they believe the cryptographic scheme is set up so that if some person knows the secret key, they can decrypt even if the message was not meant for them. So imagine somebody publishes their public key online. You use option 2 to encrypt your message for this person. If somebody has a backdoor key, they could decrypt the message and read it even though they're not the intended recipient. So typically backdoors in cryptography are really bad. And the reason people use standardized cryptographic schemes and don't come up with new cryptography for everything is because it can be really hard to detect if there's a backdoor in a new cryptographic scheme or not. And so people are really skeptical, and so they prefer to try like battle-hardened methods that people have studied extensively. Now, so why am I mentioning backdoors? Well, this idea actually becomes like kind of interesting, because what we essentially want to do is have the secret key here basically be a backdoor. Okay, a backdoor key. And whenever you submit your move for the game, what you do is you encrypt to a key you generate, so you can always decrypt your move. But you don't only encrypt it with your secret key, you also encrypt it with this backdoor key. So it means that you can decrypt your move at any time, but so can the owner of the secret key. Okay, so we went from only encrypting to a single key to now encrypting to two keys, yours and the secret key. Now the second step for this system is we'll use something called BLS. BLS. And if you haven't heard of BLS, it's a way to do efficient key aggregation. And what do we care about key aggregation? Well, what if we had the secret key owned by a multisig? Okay, so instead of having a single person in charge of the secret key, we instead had a lot of people in charge of the secret key, maybe like 30 people, or maybe even more. Okay, and we want to say that the secret key can only be generated if over 50% of these actors agree to reveal the round. So let's say, okay, we have 30 people. All of them have to contribute. All of them have to work together to generate the secret key. And to generate the secret key, you need at least 50% of them to participate. Okay, so that means that you could create a game where you can say, okay, for this game we have like 30 companies in the world. Some of them are companies who built the game, some of them are community members. We have 30 people. And for them to cheat, you would need over 50% of them to be dishonest and work together to generate the secret key to decrypt the rounds. And assume that's not likely. But when that round actually passes, like when it comes time to move to the next step in the game world, 50% of these actors will say, okay, the round is done. Let's all work together. Let's generate the key. Let's reveal the key. So you reveal secret key. You reveal the secret key for the round. And now that you've revealed the secret key for the round, you've basically revealed the backdoor. So because you've revealed the backdoor, you can now use this backdoor to decrypt all the previously submitted moves. Okay. Now some extra properties of BLS that could make it kind of interesting is that one, of course, it supports multisig, so you can actually like have this, over 50%. But it can do this with a single key, a single aggregate key. So basically, you can aggregate keys and signatures. A single aggregate signature and key. So I won't go too much into BLS and the way it works. But here's like a very, very brief explanation. So imagine you have person 1 who has secret key 1. And then maybe like signature 1. And then you have another person in the multisig who's secret key 2, signature 2. And then all these people have a private key, or sorry, public key. And we'll call this like pub 1 and pub 2. So you have a whole bunch of people in part of this multisig. They all have their own secret key. They all have their own public key. And whenever they sign a message, they all have their own signature for that message. The interesting thing about BLS is that it allows you to aggregate these keys so that the aggregate signature for the entire multisig is just sig1 plus sig2. And the entire public key for this is just hub1 plus hub2. So it creates this like a way to easily create a public key, a single public key for the whole multisig, and then a single signature for the whole multisig. So unlike some other cryptographic schemes, like some other multisigs where you need to have like 10 keys that all have 10 signatures and 10 public keys, and you have to share 10 keys with everybody, in this case, we only have a single public key and a single signature to share. So it's much more data efficient. So like whenever we reveal the data here, we only have to reveal a single piece of information instead of like a lot of information. And the reason this is important is because for our signature, for our scheme to be secure, we want this like Timelock server to have as many actors as possible, right? Because if there's only like 2 people, they can still easily coordinate to get the secret key and cheat at the game. If we have 30 people, then it's much harder. So BLS allows you to like scale up the amount of parties, the amount of signatures involved, while still keeping the amount of data you have to share publicly fairly minimal. So it's like a very efficient scheme in this way. Now there is one major problem with BLS, is that it allows threshold signatures, which is like what we talked about, which is what we needed. So like you can say like, oh, as long as you have over 50%, that's enough. So it allows like this threshold signature scheme where you can have a subset of the keys signing. But BLS only allows threshold signatures for signing information, not for updating the multisig. What I mean by that is that like usually if you have a multisig, you need like 50% or more to sign, and then 50% or more to add participants. If you want to add a new member to the multisig, you just need 50% of people to approve. This is like a standard multisig that you might see. However, BLS is different. Like you would need, for example, if you set the threshold to 50%, you would need 50% or more to sign. But you always need 100% to add participants. Now, again, I won't get into the cryptography of BLS and multisigs and why they work this way. But basically, like the intuition is that there's a setup stage for BLS, and the setup stage requires the participation of everybody in the multisig to be involved. So if you need to add a new person, you need to redo the setup step. You need to redo the setup step, which means you need everybody to come together and do this setup. If somebody's not participating in the setup, it's not going to work. So you have to either not update the multisig or drop the people who did not participate in the update. This is like a downside of BLS, so I just want to put this out there. But hopefully it helps you understand, like, despite this downside, it has this really efficient property, and so it scales well with the number of participants, and that's kind of why people are interested in BLS. Okay, so now we know like the idea about like encrypting through rounds. We know we have this backdoor secret key. We know how we want to decentralize this key so that not a single person can cheat at the game. Now we have to get more into like the details, which is, well, concretely, like how do we implement this cryptographic scheme? And so this is like the mathy part. And so for people who don't want to know the math, like probably this gives you the good intuition. And so I just want to quickly mention that there's a service that provides this called DRAND. So if you don't want to run like your own BLS system with your own secret key generation and blah blah, there is a service called DRAN run by multiple like well-known companies and projects that you can just reuse if you don't want to roll out your own server. But I'll talk a bit more about that later. For now, let's get into more of the cryptography and how that works. So the way we're going to implement this is with something called identity-based encryption. Which is sometimes called IBE. And the interesting thing about the scheme is that this Timelock system can all be built using fairly old research that is fairly well standardized. Like BLS is not necessarily like a new idea at this point. It's been around for 20 years. We'll talk about like the curves, which have been around for a long time. We'll talk about IB, which has been around for a long time. So this Timelock encryption does not necessarily rely on like cutting edge cryptography, which means it's available in multiple environments and fairly well battle tested. So what is identity-based encryption? So imagine you have two parties. You have Alice and Bob. And Alice wants to send an encrypted message to Bob. Now, usually there'd be two ways to do this. Either you have like some kind of key exchange system between the two, or maybe Bob has a public key and Alice gets the public key directly from Bob, or maybe Bob posts it to his social media and then you encrypt it directly. But there's some cases where you cannot talk directly to Bob. You don't know who they are. So for example, in our case, for our video game, we don't know who all the other players are in the game. Like we can't talk directly to them necessarily. And we don't even really want to, because we instead want to encrypt based off the round number, right? So this scheme is not, particularly well suited for us. And so identity-based encryption is okay. Instead of encrypting to a specific public key, you instead encrypt to an identity. And there's a server that manages these identities, a centralized server. Okay? So what we've essentially done is we've replaced Bob here with instead kind of like the round number. So you want to encrypt to a specific round number. And to know the key for this round number, you ask the server for the key and it gives you a key back. So this is kind of like the base idea of identity-based encryption. So instead of like talking to like somebody like Bob directly, you instead ask a centralized server. The server will give you a response, and everybody in an identity-based encryption system has to trust the server because the server can generate the secret keys for all the users involved. Okay, so this is the core idea of identity-based encryption. And if you like look up the research paper called "Identity-Based Encryption from Wheeled Pairing," you will get like some more of like the cryptography intuition behind the scheme. But just for now, like just putting this out there, like remember this scheme because this will be kind of like the base framework for how we set this up, and then our goal is to like convert this from like a single centralized server that can cheat out the game to try and like decentralize this. Okay, so this is the idea of IBE, and as I mentioned, like we want to switch IBE. Instead of being like encrypting to Bob, we instead encrypt to a round number, and then we get the key for that round from the server. Now we can take this like kind of one step further to like decentralize this and not have this centralized server, which is that we want the public key to be known ahead of time. Okay, because if we know the public key ahead of time, we don't need to like ask the server for the public key. And then 2, we want the server here to like post the private key when it's ready. So that like you don't have to like go query the server just like posts it to a public blockchain, so that the private key is available to everybody and stored on chain and is available from this perspective. So if you have these 2 key points, it means Alice never has to talk to the server anymore. So we're kind of like deviating a bit from like the standard IBE. So you still depend on the server, but the server is the one who is kind of like generating the information that you need to know for the public keys, and they're the ones posting the private keys. So you're still like leveraging information from the server, but just not talking to it directly. Okay. So how do we implement that in practice? Now that we know how we're modifying IB for our idea, we say that okay, how does the user encrypt? So Alice is a player playing the game, and they want to encrypt their move for a future round. What does that function actually look like? How does that work? So we have some kind of encryption function, and it takes as parameter some static variables, parameters that are known to everybody ahead of time. Like for example, how long a round is, which hash functions to use. It's kind of just known public information. We take in a round number, and we'll often call this just P. And then the message to sign. And the message being like your move, like I'm going to attack this player, or I'm going to purchase this building. Like this is going to be your move for the game. Okay, so this is our function. Now we want to have 3 things we generate. And then let me scroll down a bit. 3 things that we reveal at the end as part of the encryption scheme. This is all one function. Okay? The first one, we want to reveal the message somehow. Like we want to like commit to the message in some way. Let's call this W. We somehow want to encrypt this message. So we want some kind of function of the message. And we'll use an encryption called Onetime Pad. And the way Onetime Pad works is that basically, if you have a message of length 10, you generate 10 random bits and then store them together. And this gives you like perfect encryption. So we'll want to use the Onetime Pad technique, and we'll basically do Onetime Pad with a random number. We'll call this random number sigma. So we'll need sigma to just be a random number. And then we want to use a hash to basically generate the random number sigma, and then hash sigma so that it matches the same length as m. So maybe m's like 1,000 bits, maybe sigma is like 32 bits, and then hash just like maps from the random number domain to the message length. Okay, great. So now we've encrypted our message. So this is like our encryption that we reveal. And we have a random number that we use to generate like the Onetime Pad for this. Now, to get to the next step, first we have to explain how cryptographic schemes often work. So it's very common that when you want to encrypt to a public key, instead of like doing this all together into one big step, you instead split this up into 2 steps, which is that first you Maybe I'll do this in a different color. First, you generate an ephemeral key. And two, you encrypt your data with the ephemeral key. And three, you encrypt the ephemeral key, or like somehow hide it. So like usually you might think like, oh, if I'm encrypting to like a round number, I would just encrypt it right away. But actually, this is usually not the case. Usually, the reason why, and we'll see a bit later, is that we want that when this message changes, all three of the outputs of the encryption all get changed. They all like modify in some way. So you can see, like, for example, if the message changed, like if this is foo, and I encrypt again with bar, like this variable m here will change. And so because the message changed, like w also changes. Okay, so like a change in the message should reflect in a change in all the outputs. And that usually gives you much better safety properties. It means that you can't like do kind of malleability attacks easily or replay attacks easily. And so this is why it's usually done this way. Okay, so if that's the case, then we're going to need to generate some kind of ephemeral key. And we'll call this ephemeral key R. Now you might be tempted to say, okay, for this ephemeral key that we're generating, let's just also make it a random number. Something like that. This actually tends to not be a good idea. And the reason why is because imagine here down this variable called u. We're going to set this to our public key. Okay. So if you don't know this notation, this is like elliptic curve public key generation. So we have a elliptic curve with group G1, and if R is our private key, RG1 is the public key. So this is kind of like basic elliptic curve cryptography. So if this is our public key that we want to reveal, a public ephemeral key, and we said that we want everything to depend on the message, then this is not going to work. Like we can't say like 0, 1, L, because that means that this variable u does no longer depends on the message, right? So instead of doing this, we're going to set R to a hash that includes the message, and oftentimes the message is put on the other side. Includes the message, but it can't just be the message, right? Because if it was just the message, this would be trivial to like reverse. If you know the message the user submitted, then you automatically know like their private key. So it can't just be the message. So we add in sigma. So it means that the user's private key is a combination of the message and of the random value sigma. And this is perfect because it means that now if the message changes, our public key changes as well. So great. Now we have the ephemeral key set up. And the last thing is to know like the public key that we're encrypting to. And notably, like we want this to be the public key for this specific round, which we call P. Okay. So what do we actually know? Like how can we generate this public key? Well, we know two things, right? Of course, we know the current round because that's one of our parameters, right? And the other thing we know is a variable we'll call P. And P is just going to be this pub multisig. So P is this like aggregate multisig this BLS multisig key. So we know like the small p, which is like the round number. We know this big P, which is the BLS public key. And these are only the only two things we have. Now, note that these are not the same type. Like a round number is a scalar, or value, and capital P is a point on a curve. So we can't easily do math between them. And the way we will solve this is through a bilinear map. So if you're familiar with like elliptic curve cryptography, hopefully this makes sense. If you're not, like you can look into elliptic curve cryptography to understand why. So we have a bilinear pairing, and then we'll take the public key of the multisig, and then P, which is our scalar, and then we have to hash it to the curve. So these are the same type, so that both these map to G1. So these are the only things we know. Like these are only things the public key could be. And now we have to come up with the value of V such that everything works out. Like basically we've set everything up here to everything they could possibly be. There's not really any other way to set this up. And we want to, later on, like implement a decryption function. Okay. So knowing that we have to implement this decryption function later, what could we possibly set V to that would make this all work out? Okay, so this is like hopefully like steps 1 to 3, and then steps 1 and 3 here. Hopefully these are all like, you see that there's not really anything else we could set them to. Oh, by the way, if you want to learn more about like this specific transformation that is saying like R to like the hash of the sigma and M, this is sometimes called the Fujisaki Okamoto transformation. So if you want to like learn more about this, you can look it up. But okay, I just want to take it slightly detour in case somebody wanted to learn more. So, okay, so what can we set V to? Now I'm going to claim that if you set this to sigma, XORed with H2 public key P to the power of R, that this will all work out. Now you might be wondering, like, where does this come from? Like, what's the core idea? So there's two intuitions for why this works. The first one is, well, what's the point of these two things, the sigma and the H2? The reason we have the sigma in here is to basically commit to the value of sigma. Like obviously sigma is included here, but this is kind of like a free variable at this point, and we want to commit to it. So this is like putting it here is part of like this commitment that will then reveal later. And so the idea is that inside the decryption step, like as we're decrypting, if the decryption algorithm can figure out sigma, then it can figure out the private key. If it can figure out the private key, it can figure out the public key. And then, everything kind of falls from that. So we want that the decryption algorithm can somehow deduce the value of sigma. So we want to kind of like commit to it here, and then somehow be able to like reveal it in the decryption step. Okay, so that's what explains why we have sigma. The hash here is just, again, to like make the lengths work. So like note that like, the domain of this part here needs to be like the same size as sigma. So just how like we used H4 here to change like the length of randomness from like 10 bits to like 100 bits to match the message length, this hash H2 is just, again, to like make the lengths work out. Okay, so now we know like why we're committing to sigma, because we want to essentially reveal this later, and we know why we have h2. The last part is like, where does this come from? Pk to the power of r. And the intuition for this is that we want to think of this as basically generating a shared secret key. So you want, like, maybe to explain this. Oftentimes, to like have some kind of like encryption protocol with somebody, you want to generate a shared secret key together. Because if you have a shared secret key between Alice and Bob, like Alice can encrypt, send to Bob, Bob can decrypt, they can generate stuff, send it to Alice, they can decrypt. So it allows everybody to like operate together on a single shared secret key. So basically, we want to think of this as kind of like a shared secret key that we are constructing, kind of like with the BLS signature in a sense, the multisig, and we want this shared secret key to only be revealed with the signature of the round. And we'll explain what signature of the round means later once we get to the decryption step. But just like hopefully this intuition of building a shared secret key kind of like makes some amount of sense, and we'll see how that works in just a little bit. So we wanted to generate some kind of shared secret key. Okay? And so what variables do we know that we could generate a shared secret key with? Well, we know G1, that's the group that we're operating on. We know the round number, right? This is like a public information. So you're encrypting to a round, so we know the round number. And then we want to hash this scalar to a point on the curve. So we have this. And the other two variables that we have are R, which is the ephemeral key set by the user up here. And then we have S, which is the key of the BLS signature. So like what is S? S will just be the sum of the secret keys for this BLS signature. Okay, so S equals S1 plus S2. Okay, so we want to create a shared secret key, and we want to create a shared secret key between two variables, our ephemeral key and the BLS signature key. Okay, and if you haven't seen this kind of shared secret key system before, like you might have seen Diffie-Hellman key exchange in the past. This variation of the Diffie-Hellman key exchange is called the bilinear Diffie-Hellman. So if you haven't seen this before, you can Google bilinear Diffie-Hellman, and you'll find like this is like a valid shared secret key setup when you have two keys R and S. Okay, so now we know what our shared secret key is going to be. And so now we want to set it up so that we basically have the secret key up here, the shared secret key. And so to explain like, or rather to show mathematically how we've achieved this, we just have to expand the definitions. Right? So here, PKP to the power of R, you might already notice like the R's here are the same. So like we're already getting close. And PK here was EP1 HP1. So this is equal to E, what was it? H of P, which is the public key for the BLS, and then hashing to the curve the round number So this is the expansion. So this expands out to this. You can see we're already getting pretty close. And well, what is P here? Well, P is just the public key for the BLS. And remember, in BLS, or sorry, elliptic curve cryptography, the public key is the secret key times the group. We end up with this. And then note that like when you're using elliptic curve cryptography, multiplication by a group like this is similar to exponentiation. And so you can think of this as like a similar notation as like g to the power of s. And this is just like some background to explain why we can essentially have g1 h1 p to rs. So remember with bilinear maps, if you have like e and then like a multiplication of something, like you can take one of the terms out and put in front. And so if you have an exponential, you can do this like exponential number of times and then bring it up to the exponent. Kind of like hand waving this part a bit, but hopefully if you just like look up the identities for bilinear maps, like what are their key properties, and then you understand the idea that like this kind of multiplication here is kind of equivalent to exponentiation. Hopefully that makes sense why you can like bring this out. It's maybe like my explanation is not super good, so maybe like let me give it another shot, so that maybe you have like something written down that seems more intuitive. If I can find my mouse, yeah, there it is. So the identity that notably you'd want is e to the g to the power a h to the power of b is equivalent to e g h a b. So this is like the identity that you might be familiar with from the bilinear map definition, and so this is why we can like take s out. So not only we know that this is how we came up with pkp to the power of r is because it comes from the shared secret key. Now we know why this is our definition of V. And that completes our encryption protocol. So for our encryption system, basically these are the three values you reveal. And then the only thing that's left is decryption. Okay. So what is the decryption algorithm? So again, you have some known parameters. You know the round number. You know the BLS signature for the round. So here I'm setting like pi as an equal to this. So like the aggregate signature for this round, we're calling this pi. And then we know like a U, V, W. Okay, so this is our decryption algorithm. Hopefully it makes sense why we have access to all these variables. So keep in mind, like in our original drawing, we had a commit step. So everybody submits their moves during the first 24-hour period. And during this first 24-hour period, they call encryption. At the end of the 24-hour period, this signature gets revealed publicly. And once it gets revealed publicly, we want everybody to be able to decrypt right away. So there's no like intermediate step where we have to do like some interactive protocol or anything. It's the trapdoor, it's the backdoor key. We want this pi term here to basically be this backdoor key that released everybody to the world. Okay? So that's the idea. And I won't go into like the full decryption because I think there's only like one real step that matters in this decryption, which is the very first step, which is, well, how do we know sigma? Because as we saw earlier, like if you know sigma, you know the message, and if you know sigma, you can know the ephemeral key. Like as long as you know sigma, you know everything basically, right? So how do we know sigma? How do we regenerate sigma in the decryption? Well, we know V, right? And remember, like the reason we had V was to do a kind of a commit reveal kind of system on the sigma term. So we're gonna want V, and remember that like the way to undo a XOR notation is another XOR with the same value. So remember like A XOR B equals A, right? So if you XOR with itself, you'll get back the original value. And so here we XORed with our shared secret key, right? We saw that pk power of r is equivalent to our shared secret key. So what we want to do here is XOR with the same shared secret key. Okay. Well, how do we get this shared secret key? Well, it turns out there's another way of writing the same shared secret key, which is, again, h2, just like we had before, h2. And then E, which is the bilinear map of U and the joint signature. And so now all I have left to finish proving this protocol is to prove that this value here is equal to this, aka prove that's equal to our shared secret key. Okay. So now, last step, we just have to expand these terms. So we know the hashes are the same, so let's just focus on expanding in the middle. So bilinear map of U and signature for the round. Sorry, let me just like pull up my notes because this is kind of like a long expansion. Yes. Okay, so this ends up being equivalent to E of our G1. And remember, this one is just by definition. Like if you look at the value of U, you know, it's RG1. So this is, remember, just like the public key, the public ephemeral key. So this is expanding out the public ephemeral key. And then the signature comes from the definition of BLS multisig. So this is going to be S H1P. Okay. And so the reason why is because, remember, in BLS or like a loop curve, the way it works is that like whenever you sign a message, it's just your secret key times the message. And so what was our message? Our message in this case is the round. Okay. So our message, the BLS signature is signing, is just the round number. There's no like secret hidden variable. You're signing the round number. And if the BLS signature signs the round number, then again, using the same like identity we mentioned earlier, we take the R out, we take the S out, and then we put them up here. And now, we note that we end up with the same shared key. So by creating an ephemeral key in the encryption step and setting up with the right value to make it be backdoorable backdoorable using a shared secret key, where the shared secret key is generated from a BLS signature of the round number that is this multisig. We can build the full Timelock encryption protocol. I think this is really beautiful. The fact that you can have like just server out there that's running this Timelock protocol, and you never really need to talk to it. Like, note like this public key up here. What's really interesting is that all these variables are known ahead of time. Like, you know the public key for the BLS, and you know the round number. So like you don't need to go talk to the server at all to generate the public key. You could generate the public key for tomorrow, for the day after tomorrow, or for a week from now. As long as like the public key here doesn't change, like you can just generate these public keys whenever needed entirely locally. And then to decrypt, all you need to know is a signature. And it's just the signature of the round number. And that's it. There's no like super secret, like whatever. It's just generate a signature of the round number. So like if you're around 1,000, it'd be like sign 1,000. And that's basically it. And then you're good to go. And the fact that you can build like this really interesting Timelock protocol based off these like really basic concepts that are like well-known cryptography implemented in multiple systems already is just super interesting. And again, as I mentioned like kind of earlier, there is a system called DRAND that does kind of like implement this kind of server if you want to check it out. And then if you want to learn more about this system that I described, like this entire algorithm scheme, like I did not come up with this, in case this was not obvious from the video. I'm like explaining something other researchers worked. This is called tlock. And the name of the paper is tlock, Practical Timelock Encryption from Threshold BLS. So if you combine the two papers we mentioned, identity-based encryption from whale pairing, and tlock, Practical Timelock Encryption from Threshold BLS, both of which are fairly old papers at this point. Basically, you get all the constructions you need for this setup, and you already have an implementation of it that is open source that you can go read right now if you want to play with it yourself. So hopefully this was an educational video. I know this was like fairly deep into the cryptography, but yeah, for Paima Studios, we're building like these on-chain games, autonomous worlds. I think there's a lot of games that could be interested in this kind of like Timelock encryption system, but as well as it's useful just in general for just any use case that would require Timelock. So thanks for the time. Please subscribe if you like this kind of educational content. We'll be sure to explain more cryptographic schemes and ideas about our protocol as we continue to develop it. Thank you.